Welcome back to part 2 of my quarantine quarto from the Shakespeare Institute. I'm Simon Smith. Last time I was talking about wider cultures of sight in the early modern playhouse and about visual stagecraft. Today I want to turn specifically to Hamlet to think about how that wider culture of visual attention, critically engaged visual attention, might manifest in the specific case of Shakespeare's Hamlet. So there are a few long recognised moments of spectacle in Hamlet that have dominated much of the discussion of the play's interest in sight, principally the dumb show to the murder of Gonzago, and then the question of what the ghost physically looks like. These discussions can tend to be a bit circumscribed, but nonetheless in the middle of the 20th century there were a number of studies that started to look a bit more widely across the play for visual stagecraft. And this work, the best examples of which include studies by Lee Sheridan Cox and by Alan Desson, are typically quite attentive to questions of structure or symbolic patterning. The most recent work in this area has begun to foreground active interpretive models of looking in relation both to the play's dramatic world, but also to its performance reception, which is partly my interest here. Jennifer Ray McDermott finds in Hamlet's play world a hierarchy in which attent seeing is never as powerful as attent hearing, but above all, the best perceivers are those that use both senses as one interpenetrative instrument of full attention. And elsewhere, Evelyn Tribble places comparable emphasis on the active and constructed nature of sight, thinking about the staging of the ghost in order to reframe looking, not as a passive and transparent process, but an active cognitive construction. So building on such work, and particularly taking up that active understanding of vision articulated by Jill Woods and others, I wish to place a slightly different emphasis here on the play's explicit foregrounding of its own visual stagecraft and the kind of paradoxical uncertainty about visual interpretation that is then generated by the play. And central to this reading is the claim that Hamlet doesn't just hope that playgoers will engage with its various sights, but rather the play utilises particular techniques to direct playgoers' active visual attention. The first of these, fairly straightforwardly, is through explicit directions to look. The second is through the modelling of visual scrutiny and interpretation within the dramatic world, so characters in the play modelling the kinds of behaviour being encouraged from the audience. And finally, and this is particularly the case in the second quarto text, through a dramatic pattern of directly and deliberately interrupting a big verbal digression with a visually compelling entrance. So beginning with the first of these, Hamlet contains innumerable directions to look, from the opening scene onwards. Characters, and by extension playgoers, are told to look where the ghost comes again, to give Claudius heedful note, to look here at the mad Ophelia, to couch a while and mark Ophelia's funeral procession, and to bear a wary eye towards Hamlet and Laertes' duel. And these are just a few representative examples. Such moments seem fairly obviously designed to draw playgoers' attention to particular sites, both through the imperative phrases themselves and through the onstage performances of visual scrutiny that characters duly offer, and I'll turn to those in a moment. The sites in question are relatively varied, some with fairly obvious potential for spectacle, so for example the duel in the final act, but these are alongside other slightly more subtle aspects of behaviour, countenance, physical appearance that might escape sustained visual scrutiny without these specific prompts to look. So I'm thinking, for example, of Hamlet's entrance reading in Act 2, Scene 2 that Gertrude comments on, or the question of of Claudius's demeanour all the way through Act 3, Scene 2, during the play within a play, which Hamlet directs Horatio's attention very explicitly to, and with it that of the playhouse audience. So Hamlet is nothing if not clear that looking is important, both at Elsinore and at the Globe. Significantly, the kind of looking that's being cued, I think quite instrumentally throughout the play, isn't the unthinking gaze that's sometimes associated with theatrical spectacle. Rather, it's an engaged, active and interpretive spectatorship, consistent with Wood's account of dumb show theatricality. And turning to the second category now, this is actually modelled within the dramatic world itself, for many of the play's prompts and directions to look are followed by characters explicitly and sustainedly attempting to comprehend and interpret the sight before them. These dramatisations indicate the mode of judicious, active spectatorship that Hamlet's dramaturgy is seeking to evoke from playhouse attendees. Perhaps it even helped to shape wider cultural expectations. Playgoers who've seen these kinds of behaviours in plays, perhaps drawing upon them in their own responses in their future encounters with visual stagecraft. Unsurprisingly, the ghost is extended to extended ocular scrutiny and censure when it's on stage, right from Bernardo's compulsive and repeated response to its very first entrance, when he comments on how it's like the king in figure and appearance, and Marcellus picks up on this refrain after it leaves. Details of clothing, facial expression, gait and hue are discussed by Horatio, Marcellus, Bernardo, and later by Hamlet as they attempt to read the sight of the ghost. Even when Hamlet is attempting to control and limit knowledge of the ghost by making his co-spectators swear an oath of secrecy, he places noticeable emphasis on visual interpretation, demanding that the watch never make known what they have seen tonight, for fear of affording others the opportunity to offer their own ocular glosses on this sight. Horatio, Marcellus and Bernardo, and the playhouse audience, who are likewise witnesses to the ghost, are thus invited by Hamlet into a collective pact of secret seeing, the judicious looking that's taking place on and off stage, a privileged and private activity. I think this is a bit like the onstage soldiers in Antony and Cleopatra, Act 4, Scene 3, who seek to interpret disembodied musical sound on the eve of the Battle of Alexandria. Just as these soldiers form a point of connection with the audience, so I think Marcellus and Bernardo are included here in Hamlet as minor characters that the playgoers might align their perspectives with, sharing in the interpretive visual acts from a kind of liminal position that's both outside of the dramatic world and yet through this shared sensory experience with Marcellus and Bernardo, in a way also participatory. Certainly, dramatisations of visual interpretation could have practical benefits. For instance, just conveying information to playgoers who can't quite see clearly, or even just to clarify stage business or visual symbolism that might not be understood by everyone, even if they can see the stage. Thus, upon spying Ophelia's funeral procession, for instance, Hamlet details the participants, the nature of the ceremony, and the possible meaning of its visibly maimed rites with impressive verbal economy. But soft a while, here comes the king, the queen, the courtiers. Who is this they follow, and with such maimed rites? This doth betoken the corpse they follow did with desperate hand fordo its own life. 'Twas of some estate, couch we a while and mark. So even whilst he's verbally translating both the sight and its possible import, Hamlet's words emphasise the difficulty and uncertainty of what he sees, and the censorious scrutiny that it demands. Hamlet knows he's looking upon a funeral procession, but he doesn't know who's dead, and this is a state of knowledge that is perhaps inverted for any playgoers who haven't yet seen the procession coming out onto the stage, but who of course already know about Ophelia's death from the end of the previous scene and Gertrude's very famous speech. Furthermore, whilst Hamlet's suggestion that the maimed rites betoken suicide is one valid interpretation, it is nonetheless an interpretation, it's not an agreed fact. And this becomes apparent when the priest suggests Ophelia's death was doubtful, indicating mere suspicion of suicide that might return an open verdict at an inquest in England and Wales today, rather than anything any more categorical. Hamlet's very precise phrase that the deceased did with desperate hand fordo its own life, perhaps even deliberately recalls Gertrude's equally precise words in the previous scene, when she very carefully avoids describing Ophelia as actively suicidal, at most passive in the face of what happens to her. Playgoers then have to negotiate Gertrude and the priest's potentially superior knowledge of the situation compared to Hamlet's, but also the possible tact in their suggestions, because they are both speaking either directly or indirectly to Laertes, to Ophelia's brother, when they give their account of what's happened. Likewise, Hamlet's rather more conclusive interpretation of the spectacle has to be weighed against his manifest ignorance of the wider situation. One thing we're being shown in the speech I just read is precisely that he doesn't quite know what's going on. So even as Hamlet represents visual stagecraft in verbal terms, his sensorious looking is exposed as an interpretive act, capable of error, open to challenge, and this places the onus on playgoers not to rely unquestioningly upon Hamlet's visual understanding, nor gaze passively upon this notable show, but rather to view it well, bearing their own judicious eyes upon an emphatically visual and deliberately obtuse moment of stagecraft. Turning then to Hamlet's third and final visual dramatic technique, this one involves the deliberate interruption of extended speech with a notable show. All early texts agree that at the opening of the play, Bernardo's endlessly deferred attempt to describe the ghost's appearance the previous night is broken off before he even gets to his main verb. So Marcellus urges Bernardo to look where it comes again, as the sight of the ghost displaces narration about the ghost. This certainly foregrounds the immediacy of sight, but I think this interruption also moves the burden of interpretation from the narrating character, Bernardo, onto playgoers themselves. They're now being invited to engage directly with a version of the sensory experience that Bernardo had been trying to translate into language and struggling with. The second quarto is alone, though, amongst the three early texts, in making this technique a notable, and I would argue deliberate feature of the ghost's early entrances, and it does so through two passages that are absent from the other early texts. The first of these occurs in the middle of the attempts at visual scrutiny that follow the ghost's interruption of Bernardo. So at this point, Horatio is taking a kind of comparative approach to try and understand what they've seen. And he details various analogous and portentous sights that apparently preceded Julius Caesar's murder, so he's using that as a reference point for what they're looking at. He mentions the sheeted dead walking the street, visible stars with trains and dews of blood, and a lunar eclipse. And as he's describing all this, the ghost comes back in again. This time, it's the speaker who cuts himself off with a command to be soft, but he does it having laid out an interpretive frame through this comparison to Caesar that will allow the playgoers to process the ensuing sight of the actual ghost on stage. Later on in Act 1, Scene 4, the ghost's appearance interrupts Hamlet, making a series of remarks unique to the second quarto about national stereotypes, or perhaps themselves drawing upon national stereotypes. And the prince breaks off mid-sentence as the ghost enters. As the Arden 3 editors note, much of this speech is quite obscure, and this has led some editors and critics in the past to suggest that this might be perhaps an unfinished draft, this passage, rather than a completed dramatic text. I think, though, that as the text stands, it actually fits this dramaturgical pattern of increasingly tangential language that's kind of wandering away from the point, really, giving way to this recurring spectacular sight of the ghost himself. So first, Bernardo's highly deferred but direct attempt to describe the ghost is interrupted. Then Horatio's attempt to use analogy of Julius Caesar is interrupted. Finally, Hamlet's speech is digressing entirely from the whole point of being there, which is to watch for the ghost, and again it's interrupted by the entrance of the ghost himself. Just as the visual stagecraft of these passages can be hard to trace through certain scholarly approaches, so the critical impact of some other speeches in the play, I think, can obscure places where again I think there's quite sophisticated visual stagecraft in play. Act 3, Scene 1 and Hamlet's to be or not to be speech is a case in point. It's now really quite standard for editors to note that Ophelia is implicitly on stage, pretending to read throughout the speech. But critics are yet to acknowledge the full dramatic implications, I think, of the fact that the most famous of all soliloquies is not, strictly speaking, a soliloquy at all, to quote the Arden 3 editors once again. And this is particularly significant if we take seriously the proposition that Hamlet was written for audiences who were attuned to visual as well as verbal stagecraft. The scene continues the play's habit of cueing visual attention to a key moment of stagecraft and directing the playgoer's sight, but this time it's not Hamlet's contemplative body, but rather Ophelia's studied posture of bookish piety, which attention is being drawn to in an explicit and extended way. Does this suggest that the most interesting or important sight on stage during To Be or Not to Be may not actually be Hamlet himself? Before the prince enters, Polonius gives an extremely clear account both of how he wants Ophelia to present herself visually, so pretending to read a book, but also of how he thinks Hamlet is going to interpret that sight, i.e. that Hamlet is going to assume that she's in an act of private religious meditation. Shakespeare is quite fond of these visual performances of piety that the audience know full well aren't quite true, Richard III being a great example. In this case, there's particular emphasis on the difficulty of visual interpretation and the ubiquity of ocular misdirection. So Polonius's instructions to Ophelia, they don't just predict correctly how Hamlet is likely to read her appearance, they also make it as hard as possible for playgoers to miss the point that Hamlet is going to misinterpret what he sees. Polonius emphasises that Ophelia should just pretend to be absorbed in a devotional act, and he labours this point with an aphoristic remark that we are oft to blame in this. So his characteristically digressive words encourage playgoers to direct their critical scrutiny towards Ophelia's visual performance that follows, even as it suggests that this sight might be a bit more challenging to read and interpret than we might think based on Hamlet's glib and erroneous allusion to Ophelia's orisons. What emerges then is not a scene that's intended to foreground the obtuse verbal craft of Hamlet's speech alone, but rather a moment of stagecraft demanding judicious engagement from playgoers through both ears and eyes. As I've already noted, it's well established that the scene isn't strictly speaking a soliloquy, insofar as Hamlet's not alone on stage when he speaks. I wonder if we can go a little bit further and say he's not even the only one speaking during these lines, if the visual language of Ophelia's studied appearance is acknowledged as an equally significant voice in the scene. I wonder then if To Be or Not to Be might be best understood as a colloquy of verbal and visual language in the literal sense of speaking together. Now, to make this argument isn't only to acknowledge visual aspects of the scene that are easily elided in a more page-based engagement with Hamlet. It's also to recognise deliberate connections between Hamlet and Ophelia in the scene's stagecraft. I don't think it's a coincidence that even as Hamlet is apparently articulating through his speech that within which passes show, playgoers are being confronted with Ophelia's outward appearance that they've been told explicitly is not just a deliberate misdirection, but it's being performed at the behest of her father and not in accordance with her own wishes. So the play draws attention to what the audience is not being told or shown about Ophelia's own feelings about the unfolding events, even as Hamlet is being given this platform to articulate that within. In this moment then, is Shakespeare's dramaturgy not merely reflecting the gendered myopia of early modern culture, but perhaps even interrogating it through its visual stagecraft? Such an interrogation only becomes apparent, however, if Shakespearean drama is understood to aim at both ears and eyes. Here as elsewhere, the silent presence of a female character is all too easily overlooked when encountered on page rather than stage, and so Ophelia joins Jessica, Beatrice, Isabella and others whose wordless centrality in key dramatic moments is only now being begun to be explored fully through more sensate understandings of early modern dramatic craft and playhouse response. So in this talk, I've investigated the role of sight in early modern theatrical culture, doing so in order to offer an account of Hamlet as a play that is as precise, sophisticated and challenging in its visual stagecraft as it is in its long acknowledged verbal design, anticipating, even requiring playgoers' eyes to be as engaged and critically reflective as their ears. And I think this revised account of wider playhouse attitudes to sight and hearing that I've sketched out here has more implications for scholarly approaches to early modern drama in slightly broader terms. Given the long-standing critical assumptions about ears, eyes and dramatic sophistication, Hamlet is surely not the only early modern play whose visual stagecraft is yet to be fully acknowledged and explored in light of new understandings of early modern cultures of sight in the playhouse. This investigation may represent some initial steps then towards a thoroughgoing and fully sensate reconsideration of exactly what a play was and exactly what playhouse reception entailed in early modern England.